In other words, a particular characteristic may be providing a valuable service now without having been selected for that function in the past, i.e., without being an adaptation. These adaptations to one environmental problem that can be co-opted to solve another are called exaptations. Lewins, 2007, provides an illustrative example. Many people find that a screwdriver is very good at lifting lids from paint cans, but that is not what a screwdriver was originally designed to do. Some physiological traits fit the same pattern. Bird feathers probably evolved for thermoregulation, but then served the important function of early flight. As another example, primate hands probably have evolved for manual dexterity, but humans also use them to hold a wedding ring, which symbolizes a monogamous relationship. This symbol arguably helps with social bonding and co-parenting, leading to increased fitness of offspring. Yet, one would not propose that the structure of fingers is an evolved trait for pair bonding and offspring survival. The difficulty of defining and identifying adaptive traits led Williams, 1966, to conclude that evolutionary adaptation is a special and onerous concept. The onerous problem is compounded with cognitive traits because, even with contemporary species, cognition must be inferred through other measures. Fossil records and artifacts provide minimal information on the behavior of extinct animals, although they can be used to infer what animals were capable of doing. E.g., pterodactyls could fly, and the early human ancestor, Homo habilis, created basic tools. In some cases, scientists compare cognitive abilities of contemporary species that share a common ancestor as a means to understand whether a particular cognitive trait is an adaptation. It is important to remember, however, that different animals will often employ different solutions to the same problem. Mate and offspring recognition is a perfect example. This is a survival problem that must be solved by birds and mammals, particularly for species in which both parents contribute to rearing the young. Most animals rely on sensory abilities, such as vision or olfaction, to recognize their mate and offspring, but the particular mechanisms that accomplish this task vary across species. The female emperor penguin, Aptenodytes forsteri, for instance, has the amazing ability to use vocal calls to identify her mate, who has been incubating their egg for over 2 months, within a colony containing a cacophony of hundreds of vocalizing males. Figure 1.2. Figure 1.2, emperor penguin colony with cubs in Antarctica. Wow, so it stretches all the way to the horizon. It's huge. Finally, to fully understand adaptations, it is helpful to also consider the other products of evolution that are not the result of natural selection. Byproducts are side effects of adaptations, e.g., a belly button is the byproduct of the adaptive umbilical cord, and random effects, sometimes called noise, are chance mutations, e.g., the particular curvature of one's belly button, that do not provide any survival or reproductive advantage. Both byproducts and random effects may disappear across evolution, particularly if there is an evolutionary cost to maintaining these traits, e.g., a chance mutation that produces brightly colored feathers on a bird may make them more conspicuous to predators. On the other hand, environmental conditions may change such that a trait which provided no fitness advantage when it emerged may be adaptive in the future, in which case it would be more likely to be passed on to the next generation. Speciation. The concept of adaptation helps to explain the emergence of different species across evolution. To Darwin and his contemporaries, a species was a group of animals that resembled each other. A primary task of biologists during this period, the Victorian period, was to classify different animals into groups based on shared physical characteristics. By the mid-20th century, the mid-1900s, with advanced knowledge of molecular biology, species were defined based on genetic similarities, which map very closely to physiological attributes. On a general level, a species is a group of animals capable of interbreeding and producing fertile offspring. That is, different species cannot breed together, Although there are a few notable exceptions, e.g. dogs and wolves, it is unlikely that humans and chimpanzees could produce new baby organisms, even with current reproductive technologies, because the eggs and sperm would not join properly. But the common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees was a species that bred together very effectively until approximately 4 to 5 million years ago. Wallace, 1870, explained how more than one species can evolve from a common ancestor based on the idea that subpopulations of a single species may display a trait that becomes adaptive when environments change. An animal's environment may change due to extraneous factors, such as the meteorite impact that led to the extinction of dinosaurs. A more common scenario is that small groups of animals move to a new habitat that provides better foraging, shelter, or reproductive opportunities. Some of these animals may possess a physiological or behavioral trait that had no fitness benefit in the previous habitat, but now provides a reproductive or survival advantage in the new conditions. These traits are more likely to be passed on to the next generation, but only in the group of animals that move to the new environment. The separated groups, originally members of the same species, may diverge to the point that they can no longer breed together, a process called speciation. This tight link between physiological traits and local environmental conditions is illustrated by one of Darwin's best-known examples, shown in Figure 1.3. Figure 1.3. Finches with beaks adapted to different diets observed by Charles Darwin in the Galapagos Islands during his voyage on the Beagle. So the title of the caption is Ornithology, and there's 4 pictures of finches with different beaks. One finch has a small beak, one finch has a very wide beak, one finch has a small and shorter beak, and then one finch has a wider and shorter beak. So this is to eat different types of food. The same principle applies to cognitive processes, even if these are more difficult to observe and track across evolution. In other words, certain environmental conditions in the past must have favored specific types of information processing. Language is a prime example. Many people believe that this form of communication evolved in humans when the complexity of our social environment increased. The question of whether other animals have language and whether social complexity explains the evolution of human language is not resolved. See Chapter 12 for details. In contrast, there is clear evidence that heritable differences in another cognitive function, visual processing, have resulted in species divergence. Bowman, 2002. A subpopulation of clyshid fish living in Lake Victoria in East Africa carry genes that make them more sensitive to red light. Clyshid fish belong to the family Clyclidae, which contains a number of species. Because light colors are absorbed differently as they pass through the water, blue light is present near the surface, whereas just a few meters below the surface, red light dominates. Fish sensitive to red light will be better able to find food in deeper water and red-colored mates. Fish lacking these genes are better adapted to the blue light conditions of shallow water. Although there is no physical barrier between the shallow and deep areas of the lake, fish with different light sensitivity slowly separated into 2 groups, with continued environmental pressures favoring one type of light sensitivity over the other. These neighboring populations became 2 separate species of fish within the last few 100,000 years, a relatively short time in evolutionary history. This example makes the point that differences in cognitive processing, like physiological or behavioral traits, may contribute to evolutionary change and speciation. Continuity hypothesis. The basic tenets of the theory of evolution by natural selection led to Darwin's continuity hypothesis, which is the idea that trait differences between animals and humans will be quantitative, not qualitative. In The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, Darwin, 1871, he wrote the following: "There can be no doubt that the difference between the mind of the lowest man and that of the highest animal is immense. An anthropomorphous ape, if he could take a dispassionate view of his own case, would admit that though he could form an artful plan to plunder a garden, Though he could use stones for fighting or for breaking open nuts, yet the thought of fashioning a stone into a tool was quite beyond his scope. Still less, as he would admit, could he follow out a train of metaphysical reasoning, or solve a mathematical problem, or reflect on God, or admire a grand natural scene. Nevertheless, differences in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is certainly one of degree and not of kind. In this passage, Darwin acknowledges that humans and animals will differ, sometimes greatly, on many traits and abilities, but he believed that the difference is not in the trait, only in how it is expressed. According to Darwin, therefore, animals possess to some degree many, if not all, of the cognitive and emotional traits that humans display, even if only at an incipient level. Modern researchers, however, do not simply automatically attribute human characteristics and traits to animals, referred to as anthropomorphism. Rather, they test these ideas experimentally. Yet, this experimental framework was not available to Darwin, who instead relied on anecdotes from people who had frequent interactions with animals, including pet owners, zookeepers, and hunters. Each provided compelling accounts of what appeared to be highly intelligent behavior in animals. Darwin was not alone in using this technique. In the early 1880s, his friend and colleague, George Romanes, compiled a book of similar anecdotes entitled Animal Intelligence. Here is an example of a typical story. As a beautiful instance of the display of sympathy, I may narrate an occurrence which was witnessed by my friend Sir James Malcolm, a gentleman on the accuracy of whose observation I can rely. He was on board a steamer where there were two common East India monkeys, one of which was older and larger than the other, though they were not mother and child. The smaller monkey one day fell overboard amidships. The larger one became frantically excited, and running over the bulwarks down to a part of the ship which is called the bend, it held onto the side of the vessel with one hand, while with the other it extended to her drowning companion a cord with which she had been tied up, and one end of which was fastened around her waist. The incident astonished everyone on board, but unfortunately for the romance of the story, the little monkey was not near enough to grasp the floating end of the cord. The animal, however, was eventually saved by a sailor, throwing out a longer rope to the little swimmer, who had sense enough to grasp it, and so to be hauled on board. Anecdotal method. As many critics noted at the time, the fact that Darwin and Romanes relied so heavily on anecdotes to develop their theories of continuity was problematic. In the case of Romanes' reports, the observations were usually made by one person, and in many cases relate to him second or even third hand. In all likelihood, the stories were embellished with each retelling, and few of these anecdotes were later re-examined more carefully. Even if it were presumed that the animals did engage in the behaviors depicted in the stories, it is difficult to judge whether the actions reflected the complex cognitive processes the writer often assumed. In Romanes' story, it is not clear that the larger monkey threw out the rope because she understood the smaller monkey's desire to be pulled out of the water, nor is it obvious, as Romanes assumed, that the monkey's frantic excitement reflects a display of sympathy. The problem with attributing cognitive abilities to animals based on a single subject is often illustrated using the clever hands story. See Box 1.1. Box 1.1, Clever Hands. Clever Hands was a horse owned by a German schoolteacher, Wilhelm von Osten, who noticed that Hans seemed to have quite an intellect. When given math problems, for example, Hans would answer by tapping on the ground with his hoof until reaching the right answer. He could even reply to questions with German words by tapping out the numbers of the appropriate rows and columns on an alphabet table. It is easy to see why he was the toast of Berlin in the early 1900s. Figure 1.4, Clever Hands circa 1904, so there's a large crowd around him. He looks very epic, presiding over them. In 1904, a group of academics and animal trainers known as the September Commission was created to examine Hans's abilities. There was suspicion that von Osten was giving Hans signals for the correct answer. Much to their surprise, even when other individuals posed questions to Hans in the absence of von Osten, the horse answered correctly. In the end, the commission found no indication of trickery underlying Hans' performance. Despite this, one member of the committee, psychology professor Karl Stumpf, felt that surely something must be going on. He asked his student, Oskar Fungst, to do an investigation, focusing on the possibility that somehow Hans was being cued. After several experiments, Fungst found that when the tester was aware of the question or answer himself, Hans did well. But when the tester did not know, Hans got the answer wrong, for example by overestimating the correct number in an arithmetic problem. Fungst concluded that a knowledgeable tester would enact subtle body movements just as Hans reached the correct answer, effectively cueing Hans to stop tapping. Fungst never claimed that von Osten was a charlatan. The owner and the experimenters were unaware of their cueing, and von Osten was completely convinced that his horse could solve arithmetic problems. In this way, Hans offers an important lesson on the potential biasing of results for those studying animals and humans. Indeed, most experimental protocols now ensure that clever Hans effects are eliminated through a double-blind procedure in which neither the subject nor the tester knows the expected outcome. The clever Hans affair occurred during a period in which many such stories of great cognitive feats by animals were spreading. Many of these cases were likely the result of intentional trickery on the part of the owners, although others might have been as innocent as the actions of von Osten. Fungst's findings served to appropriately temper the general excitement and speculation about the animal mind, and in turn became a factor in the development of a controlled, experimental field of study. Even without clever Hans, many scientists were skeptical of evidence derived from anecdotes. In addition to the problem of reliability, they noted that personal recollections of a specific incident may not reflect typical or general trends in a population. In psychology, this is sometimes referred to as the person who fallacy, in reference to the fact that individuals often reach conclusions based on their own personal experience, e.g., I know a person who. This is not to say that anecdotes have no place in scientific research. Indeed, they are often the impetus for new scientific discoveries. For example, an astute observer may note that a particular animal displays a behavior that is unique or different from the rest of their group, such as avoiding a particular food that other animals are eating. This could lead them to investigate whether this avoidance response is due to the animal's previous experience with the food, observing another animal not eating the food, or a food aversion that was inherited from a parent. In this way, anecdotes can inform scientific research, but they cannot on their own be used as scientific evidence. Influence, experimental psychology and behaviorism. One of the most vocal critics of the anecdotal method, and of Darwin himself, was the British psychologist C. Lloyd Morgan. Morgan's disbelief of Darwin's claim for animal intelligence stemmed from the fact that all of the evidence was anecdotal and, therefore, difficult to replicate. His book, An Introduction to Comparative Psychology, 1894, described a number of simple experiments in which he presented animals, often his own dog, with a problem to solve. The animal's ability to find the solution was an indication of its intelligence. For example, anecdotal evidence suggested that dogs spontaneously figure out how to open gates, but when Morgan tested this idea systematically, he concluded that the animals learned this through trial and error. Morgan's interpretation of his data followed a straightforward rule: keep it simple. In other words, there is no need to attribute complex thought processes to animals, or indeed to humans, if their behavior can be explained by simple or basic mechanisms. This directive, now referred to as Morgan's canon, had a significant impact on the development of experimental psychology. Even today, many researchers attempt to rule out or control for simple explanations of behavior, prior to attributing higher order cognitive functions to their subjects, either human or animal. So it's similar to Occam's razor.